And welcome back to this special broadcast as we build up to Jala Kwesilo Samabandla, which will be taking place later on this evening into the early hours of Thursday morning. Right now, still joined by SABC's former news editor, Nhlakanipho Zulu. Nhlakanipho, let's just quickly then touch on the moment that the king is, the coronation of the king happens in 1971. This was also during the height of the anti-apartheid movement. How did the king handle that, considering how young he was at the time as well? I think it was about 23 years.
He was quite young, and I am lucky that at that time I was also very young, and I witnessed the coronation of the king, and knowing him personally, even at that point in time as he was actually growing up. So he was caught up in a difficult time, because you would remember that South Africa at the time, it was at a time when the homeland government system was also starting, and it was at a time when the definition of all that was leading to self-governing territories. And him coming from a different era and getting into that era, he was always going to be politically and emotionally charged in facing that sort of situation, because he began to challenge the system by actually raising issues that he thought his people were experiencing and sort of limiting his people.
What sort of issues were those?
He would also transcend the bounds and get into areas where there were which were non-African, and actually raise these issues. And that is the type of a person who was young, who was emotionally charged, and who saw things differently at a time when people were submissive, and when the political change was beginning to gather momentum at that point in time. So he was very instrumental in calling for change. I guess at that point in time, he did not know what sort of change he was actually calling for, because there were too many forces that were actually there. And you'd remember that at that time, some self-governing territories were building towards attaining independence, which would separate them from the greater South Africa. And it was this discussion that was actually taking place, which was a bit worrying.
Do you think that during that time at all, that there were those who were seeking his influence, considering that how huge the kingdom was?
Can you repeat your question?
Would you say that during that time there were those who were seeking his influence, considering how huge the kingdom was?
Indeed. The Zulu nation and the Zulu kingdom is one of the biggest in the country, and constitute the big province of KwaZulu-Natal. And if you had an influence in such in such a province or region, you would actually be a target where people want to actually draw you because of the numbers, which is still happening right now, even in the new dispensation, when you actually go into congresses for different political parties. KwaZulu-Natal remains one of the major targets. So at that point in time, political sources were actually influencing him in many ways than one, and shaping his thinking as to what should be done next. But at that point in time, because of the political setup geopolitically and locally, he was actually being confused as a person who belongs probably to Inkatha Freedom Party, but at that point in time, he could not avoid a situation, because remember that Inkatha Freedom Party started being a cultural movement that was established by King Dinuzulu, or King Solomon, I mean. And it became something that had a royal taint. So you wouldn't actually, when it turned a political movement in 1975, you would always still be confusing the situation.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he tried to be above party politics, which he did even post-1994 and in the build-up of 1994, when he actually mediated in the conflicts.
Babuzulu,
and to bring you into a question,
unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you just one last question that you'll hopefully be able to answer in a minute. And that is, how would you characterize his relationship with the National Party?
I think what I can say, the National Party at the time was the government of the day, controlled the resources, controlled everything, the army and everything. So in a sense, they would prevail to him demanding certain things, but he was also very strong. I've read articles that he was a useful fool, but I wouldn't agree really, because if a person is in a system and fighting the system internally, he has to actually talk to the enemy. He has to actually compromise on certain things.
Okay then, thank you so much for that. That is Nhlakanipho Zulu, who's a former editor here at the SABC. We've come to the end of that particular segment. When we come back, we also look at chiefdoms on the continent, looking at Tanzania as well as Uganda.